Does the USCIS actually believe every marriage case is fake? We talk about it a lot in our videos, but what does it actually mean? In this video, we'll be breaking down the USCIS's outlook on marriage green card cases, and we'll be sharing information that will help you get through this process with ease and avoid any potential complications. Now, one of the most common things we immigrant couples hear about when looking into this process is evidence. More specifically, bona fide marriage evidence, which often causes our application packets to expand into the several hundreds of pages. Just look at a few posts from members of our marriage immigration method posted inside our private community. So why such an emphasis on evidence? Well, because of marriage immigration fraud. So first things first, entering into a fake or sham marriage as a means of getting a marriage green card is illegal. The Immigration Marriage Fraud Amendments Act provides a penalty of 5 years imprisonment and a $250,000 fine for any individual who knowingly enters into a marriage for the purpose of evading any provision of the immigration laws. Now, for a marriage to be valid under U.S. immigration law, it is not enough that the couple had a real marriage ceremony and got all the right governmental stamps on their marriage certificate. They have to intend to live in a real marital relationship in order to establish a life together following the marriage ceremony. And couples must prove their intention through their actions. This is where pictures, texts, and other evidence from before the wedding that shows the growing relationship is so important to include with your application. Ultimately, if the couple doesn't actually intend to establish a life together, their marriage is considered a sham. So then, what does the USCIS expect a real marriage to look like? The USCIS expects to see evidence showing that you have a lot in common. You'll want to show that you live together or have evidence demonstrating a compelling reason why you don't. They'll also want to see that you do things together, like take vacations, celebrate important events, birthdays and holidays, join clubs or gyms, and have pets and children. Showing a life together is not quite enough. The USCIS places a lot of importance on the combination of financial and other aspects of your lives after marriage. This can include things such as sharing bank and credit card accounts, as well as ownership of property such as cars and houses. And if you rent, then shared responsibility of the rental obligations often demonstrated by shared lease agreements. The USCIS loves seeing that you're not just sharing finances together, but you also share liabilities. And that's not all. Do people know about your relationship? If friends, family, landlords, and employers, etc. don't know about the two of you, the USCIS might interpret that as you both having something to hide. Couples often ask us, can the USCIS actually show up at our home? They can and certainly show up at your home, but they can also show up at your place of employment. Reach out to your landlord or neighbors, and etc. The more detail you can provide, the greater the span of time your evidence represents, and the more key components you include with your application, the less likely you'll raise red flags with the USCIS. It's highly unlikely for the USCIS to show up at your doorstep when you present a case where it's absolutely obvious that you're living in a marital relationship. Luckily, they simply lack the resources to show up at every couple's house, so they would normally do that when the case has some red flags. We created a truly comprehensive bona fide marriage evidence list that you can grab for free from the links in the description below, so you can get an idea of what will need to go into your application. While it's not necessary to include everything on this list, it does help to have as much as possible, as well as to be creative with the evidence you can come up with. So, if we're going to determine whether the USCIS believes every marriage case is fake, a good place to look is who has the burden of proof. Often, couples have this idea, well, we do have an absolutely legitimate relationship, we're not doing this for papers, so the USCIS better figure it out and give us that green card. But you do need to know that the burden of proof is a legal standard that requires parties to provide evidence to demonstrate that a claim is valid. And it's stated by the USCIS that the burden is on the applicant to establish that he or she is in a valid marriage with his or her U.S. citizen spouse. That's further backed up by the fact that you're responsible for collecting and submitting your marriage evidence to the USCIS. So what does this burden of proof mean then? Well, it means that one party has the burden of proof to show that they are correct, while the other party has no such burden and is presumed to be correct. Thus, in your marriage green card case, you have the burden of proof to show that you're in a legitimate and non-fraudulent marriage, while the USCIS, on the other hand, has no such burden and is presumed to be correct. But in the context of marriage immigration, what is the USCIS presumed to be correct about? The inverse of what you're trying to prove, which is that your marriage case is fake. So, does the USCIS then actually believe every marriage case is fake? Here are 5 factors we'll be using to determine if this is the case. First, according to the burden of proof, it would appear that the presumption of the USCIS is contrary to what immigrant couples are trying to prove, namely that their marriage is a sham. Second, the USCIS simply processes immigration-related cases. But did you know that there's a separate fraud detection and national security directorate that detects, deters, and investigates immigration-related fraud? Having a complete directorate dedicated to investigating immigration fraud suggests that it's a big deal. Third, The USCIS has set up a number of different hurdles that immigrant couples must overcome. These include submitting several hundreds of pages of bona fide marriage evidence, conducting home visits, conducting interviews, and even conducting Stokes interviews where both spouses are separated, ask the same set of questions, and then comparing the two sets of responses for discrepancies. But that's not all. Fourth, even if your interview is waived and you receive your initial green card approval, newer couples must go through a 2-year testing period. What does that mean? That the USCIS will issue couples who've been married less than 2 years at the time of approval a conditional green card, and then requires these couples to go through the removal of conditions process on that green card. This is the second step of the process that our marriage immigration method program covers, but essentially, you'll need to go through a separate process to get your permanent green card. And you'll be required to prove once again that the marriage is bona fide and ongoing. The USCIS requires you to provide more documentation of your shared life, covering the 2-year period since the conditional approval. And finally, fifth, you'll also be required to demonstrate you have a bona fide marriage when it's time to apply for naturalization. Again, this is another step our program covers to ensure immigrant couples are completely guided through their entire immigration journey. But look, when you're married to a U.S. citizen, you're eligible to become a U.S. citizen yourself in only 3 years. At that time, the USCIS would again want to see that the marriage is bona fide and ongoing. You will need to submit official civil records to the USCIS to demonstrate that yet again. Quick hint here, you better file your taxes together to avoid any potential red flags. Now, with all of that, it should be apparent that the USCIS does in fact presume that every marriage case is fraudulent. It becomes pretty obvious when considering how much emphasis they place on having immigrant couples prove the bona fide nature of their marriage. And thus, this is why it's so important to handle this process right and on the first try. Any deviation or slight inconsistency, while not necessarily fatal to your case, can easily alert heightened scrutiny over your case, and that is precisely what you're trying to avoid. Avoiding even the smallest mistakes simply helps you get through this process faster and with significantly less headache. Thank you for watching. Give this video a like, and we'll see you next week.